Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on legal and regulatory developments affecting molecular testing. My name is Peter Kazon. I'm an attorney with the firm of Alston & Bird in Washington, D.C., although actually today I'm talking to you from the very tip of Cape Cod. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. This presentation today is maybe a little bit different than some of the other presentations that you may be attending, because this is looking at the legal and regulatory issues that affect all of the incredible new developments and discoveries that you folks are all working on. The idea, of course, being that as wonderful as these things are, you may at some point want to be either paid for them or try and bill for them or try and commercialize them. And at least in the United States, there are an incredible number of regulatory hurdles that you have to be aware of. And this happens to be an area which is changing just exponentially even as we speak about it. So the idea is to try and give you some of an overview of what are the various legal and regulatory issues that are affecting this sort of testing and things that you want to be aware of as you're developing it. And so our agenda today is to talk about some of those key regulatory and reimbursement issues, and they fall into certain basic categories. One is what the FDA is doing, the FDA, of course, being the primary regulatory agency that affects all medical devices and drugs in the United States. How these things are being billed and coded, because coding obviously affects everything else in terms of how things are being paid. And there are some very significant changes that are going on now in terms of how laboratory testing is going to be reimbursed over the next few years. And we're going to be talking about that in particular. Every year, Medicare has to adjust what it will pay for physician services in the coming year, which is based on a formula that we refer to as the SGR, or Sustainable Growth Rate Formula. That formula is basically changed every year because if not, physicians would receive a very large cut, and we refer to that usually as the physician fee patch legislation. This year, when Congress did that patch, they included some provisions that affect clinical laboratory testing that are going to be very significant. And in the payment area in particular, we'll be focusing on Medicare because that's the largest payer, but what Medicare does basically tends to affect everything across the board. So the first thing that we're going to want to talk about are the FDA issues. The Food and Drug Administration is the U.S. agency that regulates drugs, food, and medical devices. And laboratory tests, at least in some areas, are considered medical devices. When a manufacturer creates a kit that then is sold to laboratories that is used to perform a particular type of test, that kit is considered a medical device, and it has to go through an FDA approval or clearance process. Most of the types of tests that we're thinking about today in terms of genetic tests and molecular tests aren't really done as kits. They're really done as something that are called laboratory developed tests. And laboratory developed tests are tests that are developed within an individual laboratory and for use within that laboratory. They're not the actual kit itself by which the test is done is not sold in commerce and sold to other laboratories. Historically, the FDA has not regulated laboratory developed tests. We used to call them homebrew tests, nomenclature we don't really use as much anymore. So if a test qualifies as a laboratory developed test, then the FDA says it exercises its enforcement discretion and does not regulate that test, doesn't require the manufacturer to register with the FDA, and doesn't require that the tests go through a pre-market approval clearance or process. However, that restriction or that exemption is somewhat limited, and the FDA has taken action against products that it believes are not really laboratory developed tests and really should be going through the FDA process. But the FDA has noted that it is beginning to have some concerns about the use of this exemption. And obviously, it's a great benefit to somebody who's developing a laboratory test not to have to go through the FDA approval process. It saves a lot of time and saves a lot of money. In 2007, the FDA first suggested that it might begin to regulate laboratory developed tests. And it looked at a particular sort of test that it called in vitro devices multivariate index assays, or IVD-MIAs. And those are tests that use a particular algorithm and look at the results from various biomarkers, put them through that algorithm, and then come up with an index or something that predicts what a clinical result will be. The FDA did 2 drafts of guidances with regard to these, but it never finalized them. And in 2010, it announced that it was looking at a more comprehensive approach, and instead decided it would regulate all of LDTs, regardless of whether they were IVD-MIAs or something less elaborate. And in 2010, it said that we are committed to doing this and regulating LDTs, although the type of regulation still is not clear. FDA continues to state that it is its intention to regulate laboratory developed tests. It is probably the worst kept secret in Washington that the FDA has drafted 3 different draft guidances, and one dealing with sort of the general regulatory framework, one addressing whether or not registration or notice is required, and one looking at how the FDA requirements and the CLIA requirements can be harmonized. CLIA is the broad quality control regulation that applies to all clinical laboratories. Those guidances are believed to be finalized. It is widely believed that they are being reviewed now by the Office of Management and Budget, which has to review all of these types of guidances, and they seem to be kind of held up there or are getting pretty close review there. So no one knows for sure when these draft guidances will be issued, or if in fact they will ever be issued. But despite the fact that the laboratory developed test guidances haven't been issued, the FDA has taken a lot of other actions in this area that will reach many of the sorts of molecular diagnostic tests that I'm sure many of you are developing. Probably one of the most important areas is in the area of what are called companion diagnostics. Companion diagnostics are those tests where the diagnostic is used to determine who is a candidate for a particular test. For a particular drug or therapeutic product. Obviously, HER2/neu and Herceptin are the best examples of this. In order to determine whether someone should be receiving Herceptin, you do HER2/neu first to determine whether or not the drug is likely to be effective for them. And so the FDA has said we expect that it expects more and more tests to be and products to be developed with a companion diagnostic test. Now, with regard to this, the FDA has said this isn't just a test like cholesterol that's useful in determining whether or not you should be on Crestor or something like that. And it also has recognized that for certain products where there may be a novel or a rare use, it may be difficult for that to be developed, but basically the FDA has said it expects in the future that more and more drugs, and we're talking primarily about oncology drugs in this area, will also have a companion diagnostic that helps to predict who the particular drug will be useful for. The FDA issued a draft guidance several years ago on companion diagnostics, and the final guidance is expected at any time, and FDA has said it is a high priority for 2014. They said the same thing for 2013, though, so it may still be a little bit of time. What's significant about this, though, is many of the tests that we're talking about as laboratory developed tests are in fact used as companion diagnostics. That is, they are tests that are developed to help predict what types of therapies may be effective in a particular individual. And so if the FDA comes out with guidance that requires that that the companion diagnostic be FDA approved or cleared, that will have an impact on a large number of laboratory developed tests. The other area in which the FDA has taken action and that has some impact on the sorts of tests that we're talking about today deals with those tests that are labeled as research use only or investigational use only. Often in the past, some manufacturers would label their products in this way, either RUO or IUO, which means that they are not intended to be used for clinical purposes, even though there was an acknowledgement or sort of a tacit understanding that in fact the laboratory was going to take these particular products and use them as for clinical purposes. The FDA felt that was an evasion of their rules and regulations and came down with their RUO-IUO guidance, in which it said that they were concerned about this, that manufacturers had to take steps to make sure that basically that the IVDs were not being misused. You could not, for example, as a manufacturer, say, here is a product, it's RUO-IUO, but here's how you would use it in a particular clinical purpose. You couldn't include statements, for example, that say that clinical laboratories could validate the test through their own procedures and then offer the test as a laboratory developed test. And if the manufacturer knew or had reason to know that the laboratory really was going to use it in a clinical use, or for example, didn't do any research or investigation, then it might be liable for selling the product in that particular instance. And it would also come under FDA scrutiny if it offered support to the laboratory for a particular clinical purpose. So even though the FDA has not issued the laboratory developed test guidance that supposedly is in the pipeline, there are a number of other ways in which they can reach many of the diagnostic tests that we're talking about under these other regulatory initiatives. And the FDA has, as we've said, taken some action against other sorts of tests where it thinks they do not meet regulatory requirements. The most significant one is probably the action that it took against 23andMe, which is a company that offers direct-to-consumer genetic testing. And the FDA had alleged that the company had not adequately validated the testing that it was offering, and basically sent a cease and desist letter to the company telling it that it couldn't market these tests anymore. And what's significant about the 23andMe process or initiative is that basically it's in the letter that the FDA sent, it said that the company had met with the FDA on numerous occasions, that the company said it was in fact validating the tests that it was doing, that it was offering to consumers, and then took no further action after that. The FDA has a history of looking very closely at any instance where something is marketed as a direct-to-consumer test, because it feels that there is a real possibility of abuse in that situation. And so, as a result, of the FDA's action, 23andMe has stopped offering its genetic testing. The testing is still available, but it's really only done to do ancestry testing at this point in time. So that takes us through sort of the variety of actions that the FDA is taking with regard to the types of tests that we are talking about. So the next area that we're going to move into then is, okay, if you get through, maybe you have a laboratory developed test, maybe you've gone through the FDA process, but now how do you get to bill and get paid for this test? And molecular diagnostic tests have a very kind of tortured and complicated history. And it's important to understand a little bit about coding because that affects how these things are now getting paid for and some of the issues that are going on now with regard to billing and payment policy. So until 2013, most molecular diagnostic tests were billed using what are called stacking codes. And that is that each separate piece of the process was coded separately. So you would bill for the extraction of DNA, the amplification of the DNA, the interpretation of the result. And each step in that process was billed separately, and often there were several different units of each step that were billed. So you might have, 20 different multiples of the amplification step, for example. But nothing was specific about the individual type of analyte that was being looked at. So when that test was billed for, the payer didn't know whether it was a BRAF test or a HER2/neu test or a BCR-ABL, because they all looked the same on the payment side. All you were doing was billing for the steps. And so payers, including Medicare, complained they didn't know what they were paying for because the analyte wasn't identified. And they had no way to judge the medical necessity of the particular test that they were doing. So they didn't know whether this was a BRAF test or a KRAS or some other test, genetic test, that maybe didn't have the same clinical utility as one of these other tests. At the same time as these new tests were being developed and these stacking codes were being used, one of the Medicare contractors, Palmetto, which is the contractor that processes claims for, well, now it does it for North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, but several years ago it also had California and Nevada, and where a number of these tests were being done. And Palmetto developed a special program by which it would get around this issue of not knowing what tests were being billed for. And it required that all molecular tests being done go through a process and get a particular identifier that would be put on the claim when the test was billed, so that Palmetto could recognize what the test was. Is it a BRAF? Is KRAS? Is it something else? And you got that code either through Palmetto or you got it through McKesson Diagnostics, which has a diagnostics process by which it assigns codes to these sorts of tests. If you tried to submit a code and a claim for a molecular diagnostic test and you didn't have one of these codes, the claim was rejected. And in addition, tests had to go through a technical assessment process prior to being paid by Palmetto. So once it knew what the test was, it could then say, okay, now we want to look at the evidence regarding this particular test and see what support there is for it. That MolDx program still is going on in California. It's also been expanded to North Carolina and South Carolina. And the key issue is really to what extent that program gets expanded to other jurisdictions. And also whether or not other payers pick it up. So that was the process until about 2011, when concern about the fact that there was no transparency to these codes finally percolated up to the AMA. And at that point, the AMA developed some new CPT codes that were more specific. And so they got rid of the old stacking codes and other codes such as what are called not otherwise classified codes or miscellaneous codes which were used to bill many molecular diagnostic tests. And instead, there were specific codes now for some of the most common molecular diagnostic tests, including KRAS, BRAF, BRCA1 and 2, and there are basically over 100 new codes. There are also some what are called Tier 2 codes, which are more general procedure-based codes which kind of lump a variety of similar, less frequently performed tests together. So, and what this does is it allows greater transparency to payers about what test is actually being performed, because now they're being billed with a CPT code for a particular test, and they know what the analyte is. Now, when you get new codes, that has an impact on pricing, because obviously everything is priced according to a particular code. So Medicare didn't use, and most payers didn't use these new codes in 2012 when they became effective, because they needed more time to observe it. And Medicare had a couple of key issues that it had to try and determine. One is how to pay for these. Medicare pays for laboratory testing in two different ways. One, it has the physician fee schedule, which is a process that is updated annually and looks at the physician work and the practice expense involved with doing a physician service. And the other is the clinical laboratory fee schedule, which is a fee schedule that was originally set based in 1984 and is periodically updated. And so one question was, which methodology to use to pay for it? And secondly, if it was going to be on the clinical lab fee schedule, there are different ways that new tests are being set. The prices for tests are being set, so there's a question of how that's being done. In 2012, CMS, through its rulemaking process, announced that it believed that these tests should be on the clinical lab fee schedule, which is where they had always been before. And CMS basically said it wasn't convinced that there was always a need for a physician to actually do the interpretation of these tests. And secondly, it would pay for them using what is called the gap filling process, which we're going to talk about in a second. CMS did create an interpretation code, which is valued at about $18, which it said laboratories could use where there was a medically necessary reason for a physician to come in and do the interpretation. Now, as I said, these tests were going to be priced using what's called the gap filling method. And basically what gap filling is a way for the Medicare program to go out to its various contractors who process laboratory claims and all claims for Medicare medical services, and basically says, Medicare says to those contractors, we don't really know what the right price is for these. You see what you contractors develop a price that you think is appropriate, and you can do that based on what the costs are, what is paid for, what other payers are paying for them, any other information that you may be able to gather. There's a fairly lengthy process that went through, that laboratories went through in 2013 about these particular tests, in which the prices, in which the tests were priced. And first the contractors come up with prices, then there's an opportunity to comment on those prices. Then at the end of last year, CMS takes these, all the various payment amounts, and looks at what the median is of them, because and that median becomes the price going forward. And it went through that process in 2013, developed the median of all the carrier-specific prices. Those became the new prices for 2014. There was one glitch sort of in this whole process. So as this process continued, Medicare published the prices, and then there's an opportunity to comment on them. So Medicare published the final prices in November of 2013, and then came up with the final prices after that. I'm sorry, it published the final prices in September. There's an opportunity to comment, and then the final prices come out in November. And basically, there was no change in any of those prices between September and November, with the exception of the price for BRCA 1 and 2. And it was reduced by about $1,300, which obviously was fairly significant. And this appears to be a decision that CMS made on its own, partly because of the fact that in the summer, the Supreme Court had decided that other laboratories, that it was not permissible for Myriad to patent the test, the DNA that was used for the BRCA test. At least that's part of the decision. They could patent other processes, but not the actual DNA process itself. And I think there is some concern that CMS thought that others would be offering the same test, and therefore the price might go down. And so it cut the reimbursement between September and November. There was several other comment periods, and finally, April 1st of this year, CMS announced that based on all of the comments it had gotten, it was raising the price. It didn't, not the full $1,300 that it had reduced it, but it raised the price to about $2,200, which was still a pretty sizable increase. But based on that, with that addition, all of the prices that were established through gap filling during the 2013 process are now have established prices beginning in 2014. The other significant thing that happened as part of this process is, in addition to pricing these, contractors were now looking much more closely at what it is that they were paying for. And now they could actually see what the test was, and in a number of instances, and Palmetto was probably the leader in all of this, began to request evidence that would show the clinical validity or the clinical utility of the particular test. And if that evidence wasn't sufficient, then they would not pay for the test. And in a lot of instances, contractors decided not to pay for certain tests that had been around for quite some time, because it felt that they were lacking any evidence of medical necessity or clinical utility. So that's been the other side of this whole gap filling process, is greater scrutiny of what tests are being offered. So if you are developing tests in this area, it's very important to be able to show, have evidence that you can present to contractors that show the clinical utility of a particular test. That is, not only that the test works, but that it does something useful, that physicians use it in a way that affects outcomes. That's a very high bar for a lot of laboratory tests or diagnostic tests generally. One other area to bear in mind here is what are called MAAA tests. MAAA stands for Molecular Assays with Algorithmic Analysis. These are like the molecular tests, but a little bit different. These are tests that use an algorithm and apply that algorithm to multiple results from different assays that result in a numeric score or an index. So tests like the Agenda Mammoprint or the Genomic Health Oncotype DX are examples of this. That is, there are situations where the laboratory looks at a variety of different biomarkers, puts them through those biomarkers through a particular algorithm, and is able to predict whether a cancer will recur, whether someone is a good candidate for a particular therapy, something like that. Most of these tests today don't have their own CPT code. They're unique to an individual manufacturer or laboratory, and they are billed using what are called NOC, or not otherwise classified, codes. Medicare has had a lot of trouble deciding how it will bill for these particular tests, or how it will pay for these particular MAAA tests. Initially, CMS said it actually wouldn't recognize the Medicare codes. It said that they were, and the reason for this is because it looked at them as basically as calculations. And Medicare doesn't pay for calculations in the usual sense. That is, if you have a cholesterol and an HDL and you calculate the LDL, Medicare doesn't pay for that calculation because it's deemed too obvious or something that the physician can almost do themselves. CMS looked at these algorithms and felt that they were similar in some way to these sorts of calculations, even though they're far more complex. Physicians really can't make these kind of calculations themselves like they could for other sorts of tests. And CMS was concerned that there really was no clear definition of what these tests were, and so how it could sort of make a categorical statement of whether or not they should be covered. After a lot of education from the industry and a lot of pressure, CMS eventually said last year it would permit contractors to make the determination of whether or not to pay for these tests, assuming that they could show clinical validity, clinical utility. So CMS kind of stepped out of it, kind of bucked it to the contractors, which made sense. And actually, contractors were already paying for a number of these tests, so that seemed like an appropriate way to go forward. There are a variety of different changes that are happening now in this area involving molecular diagnostic tests. One that's just kind of significant I want to just kind of mention because it suggests how complicated this is. Tests that are being used in a hospital or for hospital inpatients or outpatients don't get paid directly by Medicare. In fact, those get paid as part of a bundled payment that goes to the hospital. So it's often happens when clients come to us and say, okay, I have this great test, how am I going to get paid for it? And we say, when is it done? And say, well, it's done in the hospital with a particular patient or on an outpatient basis. You say, well, you're not going to get paid anything by the Medicare program. You're going to have to bill the hospital, and the hospital is then going to get paid this bundled payment, which affects then, because it's a bundled payment that the hospital is getting, basically a capitated payment, that can affect the hospital's ability to use a particular test. And beginning in 2014, CMS not only is bundling those laboratories into the inpatient payment, but it's beginning now also to pay hospitals on an outpatient basis. It's bundling those tests together as well. Now, it did make an exception for molecular pathology tests, so those can still get paid separately, excuse me, but there is a lot of confusion around these requirements, and it's not totally clear which tests CMS is going to pay for separately. So it's an important area to watch for. Now, you'll also recall that in the beginning of this, I said that the physician fee schedule is updated every year, but under the clinical lab fee schedule was established in 1984 and basically was not adjusted frequently. It was basically adjusted to account for inflation in some actually relatively rare circumstances. So in most cases, actually, even though the fee schedule was supposed to be updated to reflect inflation, Congress didn't allow that adjustment to go forward because it determined that it needed that amount for budget savings. It's kind of the crazy way that things are done in Washington. But last year, and with the idea that it would take place this year, Medicare announced for the first time that it was going to begin to adjust pricing to reflect technological changes that had occurred since the lab fee schedule was first developed. So the proposal was to look at maybe 100 codes or 200 codes a year, look at how the cost of doing those tests had changed since 1984, and adjust them going forward. And that would be done every year. There's a lot of concern about this particular proposal. especially after the gap filling process, a lot of labs felt that there were no controls on this, that Medicare would just sort of cut indiscriminately, and this could have a tremendous impact on laboratories that were doing this sort of testing. That was, so that there was a lot of concern about that. This particular provision actually was eliminated as a result of this new SGR patch that we talked about. So partly out of the concerns about what this would mean, and after discussions with Congress and because I think Congress was ready to change how laboratory testing was paid for anyway, this process, this particular provision was now eliminated and will not go forward. Now, as I said though, there are some pretty significant changes that were made and that will affect laboratory reimbursement going forward. And as I said, each year under the physician fee schedule, the physician fee schedule is modified or adjusted each year based on a formula that's called the sustainable growth rate. And partly because of imperfections in the way that formula was established, each year when CMS goes through that process, they find that the formula would, if nothing was done, require a significant cut in physician fees for the next year. So every year, at the end of the year, Congress steps in and overrules its own formula through the SGR and comes up with a new adjustment going forward so that physicians don't get the cut that otherwise they would have to suffer with. Now, when that happens, Congress puts other things in that, and one of the things that they put in the most recent bill was a provision that adjusts or changes how clinical lab testing is paid for. And that arose, number one, out of the fact that Medicare gets Congress then can score savings from that. That is, the cost of this SGR patch has to be offset by other savings. And so there are savings to doing what it did, but also because several influential people in Congress decided that it was time to now go and look at the lab fee schedule and come up with a more appropriate way of doing it. So the new approach is to base it on market pricing, that is, what are third-party payers paying in the market. It got rid of this technological adjustment authority that we had talked about previously that CMS was planning to use as a way of revising the fee schedule. So I think it's important to just understand a little bit about how this process will work, because it's going to have a tremendous impact on how laboratory tests are paid for going forward. And even though this only affects Medicare, most private payers follow in some way or other what Medicare does. So if Medicare adjusts its payments, you can expect that third-party payers will also adjust what they're doing. So beginning in 2016, labs will have to report their pricing for third-party payers and the volumes to CMS. So they will have to report the prices from private payers, from third-party payers, Medicare Advantage plans, and Medicaid managed care plans. The process by which this has got to be done is still being developed. But the way the law is written, it requires that each price paid by each payer over a set time period be reported. So even if payers change their payments over a particular time period, the price that was paid and the volume that was paid at each price will have to be reported. The pricing, this reporting is done every 3 years, but what are called Advanced Diagnostic Laboratory Tests, which we'll talk about in a minute, or ADLTs, those have to be reported every year. And CMS will have to come up with a rule to talk about how this data process works by June of 2015. So once all of that information is given to CMS, it will take all of the information, the pricing information, as well as the volumes, and determine a weighted median for each individual CPT code based on all of the reported prices. Now, there's a lot of talk about this because basically what you're going to be seeing is, CMS is going to be receiving, if they do it the way the law is written, a tremendous volume of information. I mean, labs do, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of tests over a certain period. So it's going to be a tremendous data dump on CMS. And then based on all that information, they will have to calculate a weighted median. Now, the prices will be phased in over time, so that rather than if CMS calculates a new median or a new price going forward, that price won't go into effect all at the same time. It'll be phased in. 10% a year for 2017 through 2019, and then 15% after that, assuming that you have already captured all of the required change. And so basically the changes won't be fully implemented until 2022. Now, as I said, there are new provisions. There are also provisions related to new tests as well as ADLTs. So new tests are those tests that aren't ADLTs, and we'll talk about those more in a sec. But basically, when a test gets a new CPT code, it'll be considered a new test. And so initially, CMS will set the price either through the gap filling or the crosswalk process, just as they were today. Then, after the next reporting period, they'll be paid at the new market price rather than the gap filling or the crosswalk price. Now, CMS, there is also a new advisory panel that is established by the law, which is to include experts in the laboratory field that is supposed to make recommendations about how tests are paid for. That is, whether they should be gap filled or crosswalked, and if so, what the correct price is. They also are allowed to have some impact on coverage, although that piece is not quite as clear in the way that the law is written. And CMS has to explain how it applied the various criteria dealing with gap filling and crosswalking when it determines the payment rates. There was a lot of concern during the gap filling process that went on in 2013 that the process was very opaque and that most people couldn't understand how the prices were being arrived at. So this is to require a greater explanation for how CMS is arriving at particular prices. Now, with the other type of test here is what are called the ADLTs, or Advanced Diagnostic Laboratory Tests. And this definition basically is to deal with the tests like the MAAA test that we were talking about that have an algorithm or something like that. And there's a two-pronged definition for what is an ADLT. So first of all, it has to be a test that's offered or furnished by a single laboratory and not sold for use by a laboratory other than the original developer. So in that sense, it's very similar to the laboratory developed test definition that we started talking about. So that's the first piece. And in addition to that, so it's got to be a test that's done only by a single lab, and it has to be one of the following. It has to be an analysis of multiple biomarkers of DNA, RNA, or proteins combined with an algorithm to yield a single patient-specific result. So if you put those pieces together, that sounds pretty close to the definition of a MAAA test that we were talking about earlier. Or It can be, in addition, if it's a single test that's a test that's done by a single laboratory, it can also be one that's cleared or approved by the FDA, regardless of whether it meets this other algorithm requirement. And CMS also has the authority to establish other criteria other than these particular ones. So these ADLTs will be like the MAAA tests, like, say, Oncotype DX or MammaPrint or something like that. They're offered by a single laboratory. They're not sold other than through that original developer. They're an analysis of RNA, DNA, and using a particular algorithm. Now, there are some significant differences for how ADLTs are priced and paid for versus other tests. So first of all, until 2017, when this new process starts, they'll continue to be paid as crosswalking or gap-filling tests. Secondly, or under those methodologies. Tests that exist today prior to 2017 will be paid based on the weighted median of the pricing data that's submitted by the laboratory, just like all the other tests. But when a new ADLT comes on the market after 2017, it then gets paid in a very different and, for Medicare, somewhat unique methodology. First, it is paid at the list price for the first 3 quarters. And the list price is basically the price that's determined by the manufacturer as the price that it is routinely available to most payers. So for the first 3 quarters, the laboratory is paid that list price. At the end of the second quarter, the laboratory has to begin to submit pricing data from third-party payers, just as everything else. And then after the first 3 quarters, the ADLT is paid for at the weighted median of all of that reported information. And that price will continue until the next year when the next reporting information is submitted and the laboratory and CMS calculates the weighted median. So what is significant, though, is that if that list price that is initially used for the first 3 quarters is 130% of the weighted median, then Medicare can recoup the difference. So obviously the idea behind that is to ensure that when a new test is offered, the list price isn't set at an unfairly or unreasonably high price. Now note that it gets paid for the first 3 quarters, but the first 3 quarters isn't defined. So it's not clear whether that's the first 3 quarters that the test is ever offered or the first 3 quarters after Medicare begins to pay for the test. And those are the sorts of issues that Medicare and CMS are going to have to determine when it comes up with its rulemaking process. There are a number of other technical changes that were included in the bill, and the bill is usually referred to as PAMA, by the way, the Protecting Access to Medicare Act. And this is all in Section 216 of PAMA. There are other technical changes that are included. One is that ADLTs and certain other new tests can get a HCPCS code assigned by CMS. And a HCPCS code is like a CPT code, but it's a process that Medicare runs. And the idea being that it often takes a long time to get a CPT code. You want a code that you can use in order to report all of this pricing information. So new ADLTs, which are currently on the market, can get a HCPCS code so that beginning in 2016, they can start reporting. As we said, there's a new advisory panel that will assist on payment and coverage issues. There are other provisions related to the coverage process. There's a lot of concern that some contractors, especially Palmetto, weren't going through the local coverage process that Medicare mandates and were using sort of a shortcut process by which they would just say pretty much summarily, we're not going to pay for a particular test, we consider it screening, we consider it not medically necessary. And the other process is to establish a limited number of contractors that will deal with Medicare laboratory claims rather than the current number, which is about 12. So there are some really, really significant things that were included in this, in the PAMA legislation, which will have an impact going forward. And PAMA will really change the way laboratory testing is done over the next few years. As I've said, private payers are likely to follow what Medicare does, and if their prices are reduced, you can expect that private payers will also do it. It's vital that organizations stay involved. There's a lot of questions still to be answered, and we expect that will happen as CMS comes up with these new regulations. That completes sort of my presentation. Folks, if they have questions, can ask the questions using the question and answer button. And I think I have some questions, so I'm going to go ahead and answer those. So the first one is from Doug at Oligos. And the question is, where will the multi-gene panels with analytical algorithms fall under the new coding and reimbursement schemes? What about next-gen sequencing? So first, with regard to what we call the MAAA tests, these multi-analyte analyses with algorithmic analyses. So as I've said, most of those will fall under this new ADLT process. And we'll go through that ADLT process. So that will begin in 2017. Next-gen sequencing is sort of the great unanswered question at this particular point in time. It's the question that's hovering over everything that people are really only beginning to talk about. And there's a lot of sort of significant aspects to this. You know, I think it is, eventually there will have to be new codes that will apply to next-gen sequencing, I think. And as that process continues, then those things will be priced using the various pricing methodologies that we're talking about today. But it's a great question, and at this point, it's not particularly clear how next-gen sequencing will fall into this. People are beginning to talk about it. There's a lot of different proposals out there. I think the other question about next-gen sequencing to bear in mind a little bit is, especially with regard to Medicare, you know, Medicare only pays for tests that are clinically necessary. And so if you're doing a particular test, or if you have a particular test, Medicare looks at the particular analyte and says, okay, is it necessary? Was this particular test necessary for this patient? One of the big questions about next-gen sequencing is what happens if you're getting a much broader array of information, not all of which may be necessary for the patient at this particular time. And Medicare doesn't, under most Medicare principles, Medicare doesn't want to pay for this whole massive information. It wants to pay for the one particular piece of information that's medically necessary now. And that's a question that people are really just struggling with now. And I think, again, it's a great question, but one that probably won't be answered for another year or two at most. The next question is, are labs held accountable for using research reagents for clinical testing? Again, this is a great question. When FDA first came out with its rules about research use only and investigational use only testing, it tried to basically say that the manufacturer was liable if the laboratory used the reagents incorrectly. And manufacturers basically came and said, look, we have no way of knowing what a laboratory is going to do with this. FDA could certainly come after a clinical laboratory that was using something that was labeled RUO and IUO and using it for clinical testing. Most laboratories take the position that they're permitted to do this under CLIA, and if they validated it under CLIA, that is appropriate. The FDA has never totally bought that theory, but at least for now, it tends to look primarily at the manufacturer of the RUO, IUO, less at the laboratory, but it's certainly an area where they could become involved if they wanted to. There appears to be no consideration for what the test costs when considering what will be paid, and why is that? Well, again, very good question, and the answer to that is somewhat bifurcated. So under the gap filling process that we were talking about in 2013, in fact, one of the criteria that the contractors could use were, what does the test cost? And labs submitted some information to contractors when doing that, but I think the cost of a particular laboratory test often isn't particularly significant, and the key cost that laboratories wanted contractors to consider was, what is the cost of research and development of a new test, and Medicare, it wasn't clear that Medicare would really take that into account. And basically what Medicare usually looks at is, okay, well, what's the cost of actually doing the test? What are the reagent costs? What are the labor costs? What are the equipment costs? And that tends to be the way that Medicare looks at these sorts of things. So I wouldn't say under the old process there was no consideration of that, but there are a lot of concern that Medicare wasn't going to look at the full range of costs. And also a lot of laboratories were somewhat hesitant to give cost information to contractors as well. Now going forward under this new process, I think you're right. It looks not at what the test costs to do, but at what the market price is. And I think the theory behind that is basically Congress and Medicare basically saying, well, we should be paying what the fair market value is of that test. And it's very difficult for us to look at what the cost is, but what we do look at is, what is this thing going for in the market generally? And that seems like an easier benchmark and it's a benchmark that the government is more comfortable with, of saying, okay, in doing this, we can figure out, we can look at this and develop a price from that. The next is if a lab alters an RUO test even slightly, does the test become an LDT, which can be validated and billed for compliantly? Again, this is a question that there's a lot of debate over and a lot of discussion about. Under CLIA, which is this separate set of regulations that we didn't really talk about that much, all laboratories have to be have to go through certain steps with regard to a new laboratory test. And under CLIA, what it basically says is, if you take this thing and you change it or modify it, then you have to go through certain steps to validate it. And some laboratories basically do take the position that under CLIA, they're allowed to do that. Once they do that, it's a laboratory developed test. They can bill for it. They validated it. And that does go on. The FDA hasn't really spoken out one way or another about it, although I think it's fair to say the FDA would not accept that, probably doesn't accept that approach. Its view is basically, in that situation, you're taking something which is not intended for research for clinical purposes and making it into something for clinical purposes. But that is a that is an approach that a lot of laboratories use, and so far the FDA hasn't really taken action and said anything definitively one way or another. And let's see, the last question that I have is, some molecular diagnostics have variable limits of detection below which a result may not be clinically actionable. Will those tests with enhanced sensitivity exclude themselves from CMS qualification? Now, I'll be honest, I don't know that I totally understand what's being asked for here. May not be variable limits of detection below which those tests. I'm not quite sure what the point is, but let me try and answer it this way. Medicare, and especially in this particular area, is very interested in, when it pays for tests, with whether or not a particular test is clinically useful. That is the test providing the physician with some information which he or she can then act on, and that will affect the clinical outcome for the particular patient. And that's as opposed to information which might be very interesting, but really has no clinical significance. So if you've developed this really incredible test that is very, very highly sensitive and a lot more expensive than the other tests, but it doesn't really provide any information which is more useful to the physician, then Medicare is going to say, well, why are we going to pay you extra for this when this other test is just as good? And so that's, that's, I'm not sure if that's an answer, but that's the best I can do for it. I mean, the best example of that, by the way, is the test. There's a genetic test for that indicates how you metabolize warfarin. And in fact, the FDA basically said, this is a test that should be considered for patients who are on warfarin. But Medicare basically said, look, we don't know that this is particularly useful, because even though it's this test and has this great information, in fact, most physicians are telling us that they don't really use this test because basically they'll just, they just will do much simpler tests and adjust the dosage of warfarin based on that. So we don't need this really expensive test, this really fancy test. We can use this other more direct test. So I hope that's an answer. I'm not, like I said, I'm not totally sure I understood, but hopefully that gives you some idea. That concludes all of the questions that I have. I want to thank everybody for their time. I'm also supposed to let you know that this presentation is available for CME credit, and you can go to the website that's listed here in order to get the appropriate credit. Thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it, and thank you again. And that concludes our presentation today. Thanks.